We are delighted to have Professor Daniel S. Markey and the author of the book China's Western Horizon with the subtitle Beijing and the New Geopolitics of Eurasia. Welcome to Radara.
Thank you.
You are a professor and senior research professor in international relations and academic director also at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. And the book has a very fascinating title and it's focused on an area that is generally not well talked about or not even thought about. Tell us a little bit about the central theme of the book. What is the book all about?
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree. This is a part of the world, and the part of the world we're talking about here spans along what's described as China's Western Horizon. So through Pakistan and Afghanistan into Central Asia, Kazakhstan, and on westward into parts of the Middle East. Now, Americans do talk about parts of this part of the world, but not generally in the same category as they talk about China. So we're familiar with Pakistan, for instance, in the public context of fighting against international terrorists and even discovering Osama bin Laden there, or we're familiar with Iran in the context of its nuclear program, or even with Kazakhstan to some extent as part of the former Soviet Union. But very rarely do we think about how China's influence, especially economic, but also political and increasingly security influence, might be felt in this part of the world. And when most Americans think about China and think about this looming global competition, as we've come to see it, between Washington and Beijing for power and influence globally, what comes to mind first are issues like trade, and then maybe after that, lingering issues like Taiwan or North Korea, all taking place in East Asia and the Pacific, but not so much what China might be up to on its Western front and how that might play into those global interactions, and also what the United States has to gain or lose from any of this. One last point. At the core of this book is a kind of an analytical observation, which is common to what I've called continental Eurasia or China's Western Horizon, but also elsewhere too, which is that countries that China interacts with are not just pawns in its global geopolitical game. They have agency, they have interests, they have perceptions of China themselves, and what they want actually matters. And it matters a great deal, creates opportunities for China, potentially, creates roadblocks and barriers for China as well. And so understanding these countries and their interactions at home and across the region is actually essential if we're trying to understand the likely future in terms of China's growing influence in that region. So those are the core points that I wanted to get at in the book. And then the book wraps up with some observations about how the United States might want to or need to respond to all of this.
Fascinating. We all know how big China is. It's over 1.3 billion people, and it has land border with 14 nations, and I think sea border also with 6 more nations. So totally it has surrounded by 20 countries.
Yeah, China's got a tough neighborhood. And if you think about this in the context of the challenges, put yourself in Beijing's shoes and try to see the world from that perspective. And you begin to see how challenging, particularly East Asia, looks. This is a part of the world that has some important American allies, countries like Japan or South Korea or Australia. It's also a part of the world that knows China pretty well and is, I think, increasingly skeptical, wary, even hostile toward Chinese influence in a way that wasn't even entirely true a decade or so ago. And so as China looks east, it sees a bundle of troubles, and it's still pushing that direction. But as China looks west, I think it sees also a difficult neighborhood. Nobody ever accused Pakistan or Afghanistan or Iran of being simple countries to deal with, but also an area which is less hostile or overtly hostile or familiar with China, and also more vulnerable and needy, certainly economically, but politically in many ways as well, and maybe more open to Chinese influence than on the east. So I wouldn't say it's an open door to China to its west, but it's certainly got some welcoming elements to it that China doesn't see as it looks eastward.
So just to set the stage and frame it properly, on the western horizon, China sees obviously Kazakhstan, also sees a vast part of Russia as well. And then further down south, it obviously there is India, there is Pakistan, and there are also a few smaller countries like Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. They all have different needs, and why China is so sensitive about its western horizon? What is why China is looking at these countries, and how does it look at all of these different countries?
Well, there are a number of important interests that China believes that it may be able to meet at least partially by looking westward. There's also a historical context here, and I don't want to overstate this point because I think looking toward a future which may not resemble the past. But historically, China as an empire, as a civilization, often found that its west was actually the source of great instability, of conquest, of threats, military threats. And at least now we're talking about 1,000 years ago at the time of the Silk Road and so on, there were also opportunities in trade and transit overland through this region. So China has a certain historically grounded sense of what comes from the West. Now that translates in the present day in part to some security concerns related to China's western province, particularly of Xinjiang, but also of Tibet. Some concerns that these are parts of China that are less politically stable, that have some deeper opposition to Beijing's control, to Beijing's rule. And so Beijing has basically taken an iron-fisted approach to this part of its country to quell any dissent or opposition. In addition, Beijing would like to knit up its western provinces economically with the rest of that region, and to make sure that it can close down the door to what it would consider to be dangerous ideological influences from further afield to the west. So it has a security concern as well. And this has been exacerbated over the past few decades, particularly in Xinjiang, among the Uyghurs, who many of whom are Muslim, and some small number of whom have taken up a more radical style of politics and even a violence inside of China. China has tried to quash that and has actually undertaken extraordinary repressive measures there, which are unlikely to work. But nevertheless, broadly concerned about how these individuals, Muslims throughout China, may be influenced by what's happening in countries like Afghanistan or Pakistan. So it has a security and ideological concern to its west. But the other big elements of Chinese interest there have to do with energy. And that's, you mentioned Kazakhstan or Russia, Turkmenistan, Iran, Saudi Arabia. These are all countries that China has come to import a great deal of oil and gas from. And as we look to the future, is likely to be the dominant importer of hydrocarbons from these countries in the coming decades, assuming that at least a number of current trends hold. And China's always been nervous about assuring its supply to hydrocarbon resources. And so by extending its reach, extending its access, its ownership in some cases, its transportation networks to get overland access to these resources, pipelines, trains, and so on, China, I think Beijing expects that it can guarantee secure access to hydrocarbons over the long run. Last point, I think many of us have heard of the Belton Road Initiative, China's grand and in many ways truly global scheme for enhancing economic integration through principally by building infrastructure, again, ports, roads, rails, and investing in a variety of development projects across the world. Well, many of these projects, though certainly not all of them, are likely to take place in this swath of continental Eurasia. Pakistan is area in some respects, We're seeing that through Central Asia and on into the Middle East too. This is the type of thing that would permit China virtually, if not in an old-fashioned way of territorial conquest, at least a virtual access, capacity to influence, and even over time, military access to project its military power across continental-sized territory that it doesn't enjoy now. And without that, China is still kind of an East Asian power, bottlenecked on its eastern front facing the sea, with limited capacity to expand. But with that, with this broader opportunity across continental Eurasia, China becomes potentially a true superpower with the capacity to compete with the United States geopolitically and the West more broadly over this coming century. So these are the kinds of things that Beijing sees and which are drawing China into continental Eurasia and have drawn it in already.
For those of us who may not be aware of China's geography a little bit in granular fashion, Xinjiang is the largest province of China, and it is on the most western front, and also is 20% of China's oil comes from there, and 40% of the cleaner coal comes from there, and also only 1.5% of the population is in that province. And at the same time, it is ideologically very different. It's also Muslim population as well. At the same time, China in the last 30 years have grown richer, more sophisticated, and more powerful. And it is also looking to obviously increase its influence in that part of the world as well. There are a lot of countries involved in it, and let's take one at a time there. And I think China made the focal point of its kind of Western horizon focus or ambition as Pakistan. And as you explained in the book, that, or as you just explained, the Belton Road Initiative is a big project of China looking outward. So how all that came together in Pakistan? What is going on in Pakistan and between China and Pakistan historically, how the relationship has been, and recently how that relationship has kind of changed or modified, and also it is impacting the rivalry between China, India, and Pakistan.
Yeah, this is a really interesting story. And in fact, this is a big part of the story that got me interested in writing this book in the first place. I came to this book having spent more or less the prior decade plus really looking at U.S. relations with Pakistan and thinking deeply about Pakistan's role in the region. And as I did so, I became increasingly convinced that the big storyline in Pakistan, the big change, I mean, there are a lot of things about Pakistan that were capturing headlines in the United States, mainly having to do with Afghanistan and terrorism. But the big thing, if you were looking closely at Pakistan, that seemed to be shifting were the terms of its relationship with China. Not because Pakistan hadn't had a close relationship with China, because it had. And really, the modern history of Pakistan-China relations dates back to the early mid-'60s, and there are converging views of India. And both of them, of course, Pakistan has seen India as problematic, as a hostile neighbor, and then of course India felt the same with Pakistan. And in that context, Pakistanis and their leaders tended to see China as a very helpful neighbor, and China, for its part, placed less strategic weight on the benefits of Pakistan, but also saw some utility in its ties with Pakistan. So both saw one another as mutually strategically beneficial, relied on each other for a variety of things, not least China used Pakistan as it contemplated and then secured an opening to the United States in the 1970s. And that kind of narrow partnership, even strategic partnership, and some would say quasi-alliance between the two countries, persisted for decades and extended into areas of military cooperation, and not least there's all kinds of evidence of China's involvement in Pakistan's nuclear and missile programs, and their acquisition led to Pakistan being the nuclear power that it is today. All throughout that effort, though, their relationship was relatively narrow. That is, mainly leader-led at the government-to-government or military-to-military level, without a great consequence for Pakistan's economy or a broader sense of connection between the two countries. And that began to change, and that's what's really been shifting over the past, say, 5 to 10 years, as China has begun to see Pakistan and invest in Pakistan in terms of infrastructure, especially. And in the book, I open with the story of China's involvement in the Gwadar port along the Arabian Sea, a new deep sea port that Pakistan approached China to ask it to build. But it's also now extended into the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, known in the region as CPEC, which has been the big news in Pakistan up until the pandemic and coronavirus. It really captured most of the nation's headlines and attention with regard to a big news story of tens of billions of Chinese dollars invested in Pakistan to build out its energy sector, to contribute to infrastructure more broadly, especially in transportation, and increasingly to try to contribute to Pakistan in a broader and deeper way. So in all of that, China and Pakistan have been brought closer together over the past decade. And then to bring the story up to speed, the question was what that was going to yield for both sides. And interestingly, what I describe in the book is that this hasn't been an entirely good news story for either side. And I tend to focus on what it's meant for Pakistan. And what I see there is a lot of China's involvement and investment has had mixed political and economic ramifications for Pakistan. Some Pakistanis stand to win, others win less, some actually are outright losers. And that has created, in some ways, some additional frictions inside of Pakistan, a country that can't really afford too many internal frictions, and has also made the relationship with China, in some ways, actually more complicated, more challenging, and more fraught than it ever was for the prior decades, where they had this more narrow and strategically oriented relationship. Now they actually have to deal with one another, negotiate more intensely, see Chinese nationals inside of Pakistan coming and going, negotiate all kinds of economic deals. And the Chinese haven't always been too happy with the outcomes of these either. They've been frustrated with the pace of projects inside of Pakistan, frustrated by corruption, by lack of government capacity, and so on. And I would say up in the latest stage in this entire story, what we've seen is a kind of a mutual dimming of aspirations or narrowing, maybe a return to a somewhat narrower view of the relationship, going back to that tradition of a more strategic relationship. And the question now, getting to the coronavirus and post-pandemic era that hopefully we'll get to in the next couple of years, the question now is how that will make China's involvement in Pakistan easier or harder, and what it will mean for Pakistan itself, what opportunities it will have looking forward. So that's been the development over time. But it's been clear, just pulling back to the question you asked, it's been clear that Pakistan in the Belton Road Initiative has been what China initially called a flagship project, a real piece of the overall global initiative. And so Beijing has a lot invested in Pakistan, a lot riding on it. President Xi Jinping in particular, this is a prestige project, something that's personally associated with his leadership, and they can't afford to see be a true failure. And so a lot of eyes will be on Pakistan as China moves forward.
There are two issues that are interrelated when you look at China-Pakistan relationship. One, China has always marketed the Belt and Road Initiative, which had many names in the prior incarnations, that it is a win-win situation. It will help us to build infrastructure. It will improve your nation, and as a result, you will also feel that you're part of the whole development story. But reality is a little bit different. And unfortunately, that has been played out in Sri Lanka, in Malaysia, in Cambodia, in Vietnam, and in many other countries with a very frustrating and different outcome. So the question then it leads to is that what is China trying to achieve through Belt and Road Initiative, and whatever its ambitions are, is it really the best way to go about it, or China may have to scale down? Because just in Pakistan alone, China had announced almost $55 billion worth of projects, and not even one-third of them are finished anywhere. And also, in addition to that, there was a minister in Pakistan's parliament said that 90+% of the benefits or income that will come from the linking of the Gwadar project to China and so on will benefit or flow back to China and not to the local population.
Yeah, there is no doubt, and even though there was no doubt, that many of the claims, particularly claims of the Belt and Road Initiative, not just made by Beijing, but actually made by Pakistan in this case, and by a number of China's other partners, that they were outsized claims. They were projections that were probably never realistic to begin with, and that they would be scaled back considerably. In part because, again, coming back less to what China wanted out of this, but coming back to the challenges of dealing with any of these countries. Investment in Pakistan is not easy. Finding what you would call shovel-ready projects that are easily built or maintained and that are likely to turn a profit in any foreseeable future is not the easiest thing. And so meeting up with those frustrations, those on-ground frustrations, was something that was inevitable. And to some extent, of course, China anticipated that. I don't think that they were omniscient. I don't think, unfortunately for Beijing, I think they've been frustrated by some of these developments. They had hoped that this wasn't going to be quite as difficult. They were perhaps even, to some degree, I might say, naive or at least inexperienced in the challenges that they were about to face. At the same time, one cannot simply go into this, again, we should not be naive in thinking that China's only goal was to promote a win-win outcomes. China had and has a broader strategic agenda to demonstrate its leadership in its region, to win friends, buy friends, influence regional partners to achieve its own purposes, some of which are economic, but many of which, as I mentioned before, also extend into the security realm and into China's sense of what it wants to accomplish as a big power in the world. And some of these efforts, I think, could be seen in more commercial terms, but many of them, even most of them, had something to do with this broader Chinese desire to basically say that it has arrived on the world stage. And under President Xi Jinping, this point has been made quite clearly. China is no longer, as it used to say in the past, hiding and biding its time, or hiding its power and biding its time and waiting for the moment when it could emerge on the world stage. Now it has emerged. And now China has shifted over, as I detail in the book, into a pattern of for achievement and showing itself to be a big power, proving itself. And that's what is going on in a lot of these places. Now, it hasn't worked terribly well. You went through a litany of other countries, including Sri Lanka, Malaysia, and so on, where Chinese investments seem not, first of all, have not been win-win. Secondly, China's been accused of undertaking what's been called in Washington, among other places, debt diplomacy, basically starting projects that these countries can't afford, forcing these countries or enticing these countries to take out loans that they can't pay back, and then turning the loans, that debt, swapping that for equity or actually ownership shares over parts of these countries, whether it's ports or otherwise, and then effectively nefariously implementing a vaguely colonial or imperialistic agenda that would extend China's power and influence into the future. I think to some extent those stories have a nugget of truth to them. But in order to understand them, I think, again, I make this basic point, we need to come back around to understand what's happening within each of these countries. So if you look, for instance, at Sri Lanka, you see leadership, a national leadership that got in bed with the Chinese. It took out loans and built the port of Hambantota, its own political and domestic reasons that had little to do with getting into bed with Chinese per se or extending China's influence, and everything to do with extending their own power and control in Sri Lanka. Understanding that helps us to understand what opportunities may or may not be available to the Chinese going forward. So it's not easy to say, well, this is a Chinese plot to take over the region, and we're just seeing that unfold. What we are seeing is a giant Chinese goal of demonstrating itself to be a world power, of making resources available, of taking advantage of opportunities as they present themselves, but also very localized stories of what opportunities will be available. And those stories are shifting stories as well. In the book, I talk about Malaysian politics and surprise political outcomes, which reversed, at least temporarily, China's position in the country. And we can see that type of thing happening in a variety of places. Even in Pakistan, China's position has risen and fallen as a new government came into place. We'll see that again and again because that local story really matters. And China doesn't just get to run roughshod over these other countries in the region. They get a vote, they get a say, and that will continue to affect outcomes.
You have a very penetrating quote in the book where you say, when it goes abroad, meaning China, usually puts its commercial and economic foot first, but the security boat is following not far behind. And at the same time, you have another quote there as well, that it is the weak who will determine many times the outcome of many of these initiatives and not the strong, which is China. And that's really very fascinating when you say sometimes the interest of the weak or the lesser states in the region will determine political outcomes more than of the strong.
Yeah, it's interesting. The first quote you mentioned in terms of putting the economic foot first and the military boot follows, I think that's actually quite revealing about what makes China in this 21st century different and why we have to be into history of imperial kind of story. It isn't actually even the same kind of a colonial conquest. The British East India Company also led with an economic foray and then was followed up with military power. It isn't quite that, but it's maybe a little closer to that. China also has a number of other tools at its disposal that aren't quite military, but extend into the technological realm in terms of and so on that it is building and will be building in a lot of these countries that will create opportunities for China, opportunities to control perhaps some of the data or to have access to national data within its neighborhood and to control the kind of information that flows out to consumers and citizens across this large territory. So it's got a lot of different tools at its disposal, all of which it is developing. So that's a piece of it, right? Is this sort of economics first, then followed by military and other tools that will extend its influence. Understanding that element of Chinese power and the way it's being used as different from some of what we've seen before, and that's really what I'm getting at. That America has learned this, not always as well as we ought to have, but just because, say, after 9/11, we wanted to go into Afghanistan, rid it of al-Qaeda, and then eventually turn it into some kind of democracy in Central Asia, didn't make it so. And that is true for what was the world's greatest superpower and a very poor, relatively small, distant. China will also face those asymmetrical relationships in which the asymmetry doesn't determine the outcome. That is, China will be the bigger power, the stronger, wealthier player in nearly every relationship that it faces in continental Eurasia. And yet, even when it's dealing with a country like Kazakhstan, with a tiny population relative to China, and a small relative to China, but territory, Kazakhstan will be able to push back in ways that the Chinese will have to deal with. And China may find itself falling into pits or quagmires in many of these countries that it will have trouble dealing with, just as the United States has, as any great power has in the past. And so what actually emerges as an outcome will not follow the playbook necessarily in Beijing, whatever that playbook says.
To credit China, China has border with these countries and they are neighbors with each other. So China has every reason to deal with them and try to get the most out of them, like any other power will do. So, there's nothing wrong if China thinks that way. But it is generally perceived that China is the only country in this relationship that will determine what will come out. Let's take an example of Kazakhstan, how Kazakhstan has played very well balancing act between Russia and China. You go very well into that in the book. Give us a little bit of color on it, that how the balancing act has worked out in favor of Kazakhstan and to the frustration of China as well at times.
Yeah, great point. So Kazakhstan is, as I said, a vast territory, relatively thinly populated, but is also endowed with considerable energy resources, which puts it, as compared to some of its other Central Asian neighbors, puts it in a pretty good place. It has something that other states want. It also has a deep and tight relationship with Russia that, of course, extends back through the obvious connections when it was a part of the Soviet Union. But some of these things I think are less well understood, certainly to most Americans. I didn't much of Kazakhstan before I started working on this book. But I've come to appreciate that its ties with Russia extend to this day. Kazakhstan has a number of Russian ethnics, that is, people who speak Russian and consider themselves closely tied to Russia. But it also has air-based military and space facilities that are actively maintained on Kazakhstani soil that continue to be basically entirely run by Russian authorities. So there's all kinds of links, as well as trade connections with Russia and political ties and so on, that persist with Russia. And so as China gets more and more involved in the region, and as it has come to actually own and invest considerable billions and billions into Kazakhstan's energy sector, Kazakhstan's chief export target for a lot of its energy, and a target for its pipelines into and through Kazakhstan and into China. China's had to play this balance, as you put it. Kazakhstan has benefited from having, in a way, more than one external suitor, more than one external partner. So he's trying to extract benefits or play Russia and China, not necessarily against one another, but off one another, to make sure that Kazakhstan can itself maintain its own sovereignty, can maintain a sense of independence in a tough neighborhood, and to use that balance to greatest advantage. This is not easy, and part of what I look at in the book is the potential that balancing act could fail. Nazarbayev, the once titular leader of Kazakhstan for most of its independent history, now has yielded to a sort of a semi-retirement, but he actually seems to still control most of the political power in the country. But Nazarbayev is an unusual character who really owes his place to having come up through the Soviet system. And so he has by his personal history and background and long tie with Moscow, he has an ability to manage the relationship with Russia. He's also found a way to work effectively with China and not to be completely subsumed into either Russia or China. And the question is what comes after him, and whether a country like Kazakhstan, that is clearly right at the kind of the chasm between Russia and China, will fall or be pulled into one orbit or the other in ways that make the other country, that is Russia in this case, quite uncomfortable. Last point on this, Russia is in an unusual position itself. It has had a clear falling out with the West, and especially with the United States. Putin has made this clear and is suffering the consequences of that in terms of Western sanctions. This has made it necessary for Russia to work closely with China. And Russia and China have made the best of this. President Xi and President Putin call each other best bosom friends and seem to like to pal around with one another on occasion. This is historically anomalous. Russia and China historically have more likely been at odds and have seen some frictions along their shared borders. And in Central Asia is a natural place where they would be contesting for influence. And that contest, I think, is taking place. But Russia has had to yield in many ways to China because Russia doesn't have too many alternatives. It can't get along with the West at the moment, so it has to make peace with the East, and the East is now China. As we look into the future, the question is whether Russia will at some point attempt to pivot away from Russia and try to defend its traditional dominance over Central Asia and countries like Kazakhstan, or whether it will be forced to accept that kind of junior role in a partnership with China over the decades to come. Either one is a reasonable potential outcome, but both would be consequential. A Russia that was subsumed into China's orbit would extend, as a consequence, China's global reach in some considerable ways, whereas a Russia that shifted back toward the West and found peace, or at least a stable working relationship with the West, would probably pose some greater barrier to China's access and entry influence throughout Central Asia that would limit China's power in important ways. So this will be a consequential relationship one way or the other.
And this is what all not complicated enough. There is another wrinkle in this, and which is something you bring up in the book, and Chinese leaders have to deal with this. And this is something that is often not even understood, forget about being misunderstood. Throughout the region, local identities matter more than the national identities. And this is a topic that comes back again and again and complicates the Chinese ambitions.
Yeah, so local identities sometimes mean a national identity. That is, Iranians identify as Iranian, and in many ways that national identity inclines them to see, for instance, Saudi Arabia or Israel as being implacably opposed or hostile to them. But sometimes local identities are even more local than that. They can be provincial identities that mean, say, coming back to the Pakistan case, that parts of Pakistan don't feel all that aligned or inclined to see their circumstances as being driven principally by what happens to the nation. They feel alienated within their own nation. In either case, China is playing into a part of the world where these identities have important political consequences, can divide up the region in ways that China will have to navigate. And so if it's dealing with Pakistan, it has to recognize that when it builds a power plant or a road in one part of the country, another part of the country may actually see that not as of national benefit and something to support, but as having made them, in relative terms, worse off, and lead them to be more frustrated and more angry with their place in Pakistan. Similarly, as China gets more involved, say, in its dealings with a country like Iran, it has to appreciate that other regional players, like Saudi Arabia or Israel, will see that as deeply problematic for their interests and will oppose that or work to undo China's closer relationship with a country like Iran. So these national identities, localized, sweep away, I think, kind of a simplistic economic interpretation of what China is up to. Regional economic integration across this swath of territory should be a good thing. It should make it possible to have greater efficiencies for more people to make more money, and ultimately to get along and get rich together. But the politics and the identities divide the region so significantly in ways that I think really crop up and make economic realities or subsume economic realities to them, make the economic realities only a piece of the story.
Moving on to Iran and Saudi Arabia, how far back in time China and Iran go? Quite a bit. They have had sometimes distant relationships, sometimes a relationship of convenience, but most people don't realize that how big China has become an arms exporter both to Iran and Saudi Arabia, who are competing powers. Tell us how that equation is working out, or rather triangle is working out between China, Saudi Arabia, and Iran, and how each one of them are looking at the other for their benefit.
Right. So as principally seen the Middle East, and I look in this book mainly at Iran and Saudi Arabia as a source of hydrocarbon energy. I mean, that's what it needs. That's what it's wanted. It's also been an exporter of goods to the region, of commercial goods, of consumer goods, and that sort of thing. But increasingly, it has gotten sucked into, whether it likes it or not, gotten sucked into the regional dynamics because now that China is the principal buyer of energy from both Iran and Saudi Arabia, and others as well, they see their fates as hinging on whether or not China continues to buy from them, and increasingly also in a number of cases whether China invests in them and allows them to grow. I see their fates tied to China in a way that 25, 30 would have seen coming, because these countries were actually selling most of their energy to the West or to Japan. Now China's really where the game is at. At the same time, China has become an arms seller, as you pointed out, and a principal dealer in technology, as I pointed out earlier, of telecommunications technology. For many of these countries, they've come to rely on China, reliant on China for their arms. Iran currently gets most of its conventional weaponry that it doesn't produce domestically. It gets it from Russia. Saudi Arabia, of course, buys an enormous amount from the United States. However, both of them have found that in certain areas, missile technology, including missiles that Saudi Arabia bought that are nuclear capable, and drone technology, which neither of them can get armed drones. They get those things from China as well. So they find China to be a useful supplier of particularly sensitive technologies, military technologies. And as China grows and becomes a greater producer in all of these areas, and as Russia seems to be on the decline in all of these areas, as China continues to build weapons that basically are reverse engineered from Russian designs and then goes to design its own, I think there's every reason to anticipate China will become a critical, if not the critical, supplier of arms technology to Iran. Now, we all know that Iran and Saudi Arabia are in a deep and in some ways historically rooted conflict that doesn't show any sign of really going away. And so both of them see a win in terms of closer ties with China as the other side loss. And so on occasion, for instance, Saudi Arabia has worked to try to encourage China to stop buying energy from Iran. And it's done so by offering very attractive deals to China, by guaranteeing supply to China so that any cut in purchases from Iran could be made up for by the Chinese in Saudi Arabia. Similarly, the Saudis have gone, Saudi leaders have repeatedly gone to China to court investment in activities within the kingdom. Iran, for its part, has also courted the Chinese, has invited them to participate in some military exercises in and around Iran, has trumpeted a number of Chinese projects, including rail projects and tunnel projects and so on, as a part of the Belton Road Initiative, and has really invited the Chinese in to Iran in ways that they don't much do with a lot of other countries and haven't been able to do because of U.S. And Western sanctions on Iran. So they're both trying to pull in China and trying to use China as a means to basically insulate them from external conflict, bolstering them in the case of Iran against U.S. is likely to persist. So China has tried for its part to stay aloof to some extent or not get sucked into the conflict. But I think that as we look into the future, that will become more and more difficult. Just its mere presence in the region as a buyer, as an investor, and increasingly as a military supplier makes it a part of their conflict and will basically turn it into, if not a mediator, at least an interested party that will be forced to play a more active diplomatic role as well. So this is changing. And it's, I think, useful to see or to explore this triangular relationship between Iran, Saudi Arabia, and China, as I do. And in the end, I think Iran is the country that is most desperate for Chinese support. Saudi Arabia has other options, including often the United States. And so I think Iran will, especially as it is suffering, as its regime is feeling weak and pressured by the States, will open up to China in ways that probably Beijing will be willing to exploit. Access for Chinese, potentially for greater Chinese military presence or certainly already economic presence. These are things that are not difficult to imagine. and would knit China to Iran in deeper strategic ways over the long term. That will have consequences also for the way China competes with the United States, and allow Iran to continue to be a thorn in the U.S. side for some time to come. So it has larger regional and even global implications.
What is not very clear that why European nations and United States has ignored for almost 3 decades that China has been not only a leading supplier, but by and large increasingly becoming more and more reliable supplier of arms. And Washington and the European leaders know this very well. Yet China gets away with it. China deals with the United States on the trade basis, provides lots of goods, makes lots of goods, but China also can supply arms to a regime that has been pretty much propped up in Iran by its military supplies. And why Washington cannot stop them?
Well, this is one of the interesting challenges of the United States as it starts to see China as a true great power and a country that cannot just be pushed around. Now, we should be clear. I mean, the United States continues to sanction and also to threaten sanctions against Chinese entities, companies, shipping companies, and manufacturing companies of technology to Iran, and has gone ahead with some of this. So the United States continues to pressure China. And I should state the case. China has actually been careful in important ways about limiting its purchases of energy from Iran. It doesn't just go ahead and do whatever it wants in Iran or supply whatever technologies it wants. It is sensitive and concerned. Beijing does recognize that it sells more to the United States than it likely ever will sell to Iran. It's more heavily invested in the United States than it is in Iran, and so on. And so it has something to lose if it just sides wholeheartedly with Iran. It's been careful. But America's capacity to force China to do much of anything is what is really at the core of what's ending here. And as China demonstrates itself to have this great power capability, a part of that is the capacity to resist U.S. pressure. And one interesting kind of instance of this is the Bank of Kunlun, which China developed as a means to continue economic transactions with Iran, even while the rest of the world was getting shut off from Iran, principally because of U.S. and at the time international sanctions. By building a separate purpose-built bank, China could continue transactions. That bank was under little threat from the United States, and therefore continue its activities in and with Iran, despite American threats. Now, that bank continues and continues to do certain types of business with Iran, but it has limits. And this again reflects this China's still in a place where it's worried about its dealings with the United States. It has a lot to lose with Washington. It doesn't want to upset too much. So it can get away with some things with Iran, reflecting its greater power and resources in the world.
So as you draw the arc from India to Pakistan to Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Iran, and then to Kazakhstan, Russia, back to Beijing, it's not simple. It's complicated. And even as big and powerful Beijing is, they could be pushed around by these little countries, and they do.
Yeah, I mean, they will be, I don't know if pushed around, have to respond to the realities on the ground. They will have to appreciate that these countries can make China's life difficult, and will. Now, look, not all of these countries are really small either. Depends on how you cut it. But Pakistan does have about India, and India doesn't really fall into the same category as other countries because it is, I think, in some ways more wary and about China from the outset. But India is huge population-wise and growing economically. Russia also won't be just pushed around, just as it won't be pushed around by the United States, it won't be pushed around by China. So all of these countries bring something to the table, something to bear. Even with their weakness, they have certain strengths, and it will be complicated. It will not, China's extension of its influence across this region, which I think is likely, won't happen overnight, in part because of these complexities and because of the natural pushback. But it is happening. These are parts of the world, many of which have not known true Chinese influence, have been at some level deeply unfamiliar with China for centuries, if not millennia. In these new ways is a fundamental shift in the way the world works in international politics, and it's crucially important.
Just to kind of draw a little bit more connectivity here, that why the western horizons of China does matter to China, because China is a maritime player. Most of its trade with the European nations and also with the United States does travel through the maritime sea routes, but it also feels that those sea routes are not entirely protected to the Chinese interest, especially in the Strait of Malacca near Singapore and Malaysia and Indonesia, in that area. And China is trying to create an alternative routes on the land, overland, connecting it all the way to Turkey and then to Europe. So that way, in case if there is a strategic imbalance, China has another route. And also through Russia's involvement, it's also trying to build the polar Silk Road that connects to, again, all the way into the Arctic Circle and bring it down to the European nations. But it is not an easy thing for China. It is pretty expensive. It is complicated. And it could cost enormous amount of money. Even with the money that China has, it may not be enough.
Yeah, and I think I want to be very careful to recognize that China's shipping routes through its east, China's access to American, European, Asian markets, none of that goes over land, or very, very little of it. And that too will not change overnight. What I'm not really arguing is the issue that that China is attempting to shift the bulk of, or the emphasis of, economic and trade effort over land. That's not happening. It still exports mainly overseas, and that I think will persist. The point here is that China overall has resources, power, capability, influence, wealth is rising, and it's rising. You pointed out polar routes. It's rising globally in America, and as it does, my sense is that it will rise more rapidly in places that are more vulnerable or more welcoming to Chinese influence, and it will be stymied or pushed back in parts of the world that are less welcoming to Chinese influence and to China's method of doing business. And what I have seen in Eurasia is, at least initially, an openness and in fact, maybe even more importantly, a vulnerability or a weakness to the kinds of things that China has on offer that doesn't really exist in East Asia, where there's a fair amount of pushback to Chinese influence. To Western Europe, where there's clearly pushback to Chinese influence, or to the United States, where that pushback is the strongest. Where will China's power rise, and where will it accrue? Where will its influence accumulate? It's in these other places where it will create or present economic opportunities that other countries are not able to offer, where it will be present in ways that other countries are unwilling or unable to do, and where it will turn that presence into influence in ways that no other country will be able to. That's the story that I see. But again, coming back to your point, this is incredibly complicated, and each individual piece, each local story, is important. And that kind of brings me to in terms of if there's a U.S. response to any of this, is to think and act at that local level, to appreciate that each individual country, indeed, in some cases, each individual province or locality, will respond to China according to its own aspirations. And I think this is an important point, these countries don't necessarily buy into China's ideology or aspire to be a part of a greater Chinese sphere or culturally see China as appealing. In fact, to the contrary, many of them are wary, if not deeply skeptical, about all of these things, but they see China as having something to offer. And if the United States or the West or other powers is able to provide adequate alternatives, these countries would go with them as well. So it's a matter of local interests. Where China meets these interests, it will have greater success. Where China doesn't, or where there are other alternatives, it'll be a more mixed story.
And that leads us to the last point of our discussion, and that is about what should be the role of the United States. Should the United States just ignore it? What should be the posture or approach or role of the United States? Just let it go as it takes and ignore it and just be an observer from the side, or play some meaningful role, or just pick and choose?
Well, I think the pick and choose is going to be the required option for the, and I say this not because I think we'll prefer that the United States be more present, more active, more engaged throughout continental Eurasia across this territory of China's western horizon. But the practical reality, certainly at the moment, is the United States is internally divided in some disarray, feeling the consequences of this pandemic, but also the political consequences, its global influence, its credibility is not what it once was, and its ability to influence global outcomes anywhere and to compete with China is not what it ought to be. And I think that if I were to begin to sketch out where the United States should place its greatest emphasis, it would be first at home, and then to rekindle, reignite, resuscitate, rebuild with allies and partners, most of whom are not in continental Eurasia. In fact, they're in Western Europe, they're in Eastern Asia. Those are the players that could make the United States, in cooperation with them, kind of a lopsided, presumptive favorite in any global competition with China, no matter what China does. So we need to get those things back. Once or after or as we are attempting to do all of those things, which I think because of the pandemic and the economic consequences of it and the political consequences of it as well, that'll be difficult enough. But if we were to begin to do that, then I think we would be able to pick and choose opportunities in places like China's West and in continental Eurasia, the states and China, to keep the door propped open to other outside influence, and perhaps more realistically also just to preserve the sovereign autonomy to some extent or independence of those countries increasingly in China's orbit, so that they will provide a more natural set of barriers and obstacles to China's easy extension, to China's extension of its capacity to project military power up through Eurasia and to Europe's doorstep. These are all things that I would want to see the United States do, but unfortunately at the moment we got to get our own house in order first. That includes, as I say, our domestic situation, our economy, our public health, our institutions need a lot of tending before they'll come back around and be what they once were.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for your insight, analysis, and a different perspective on the region and China's challenges and struggle in Central Asia or Eurasia. Thank you very much once again.
Of course, it was great talking with you. Thank you.
Thank you.